There is a kind of silence that isn't the absence of sound, but the absence of being heard. It settles early, sometimes even before the first words, and it grows, subtly, as if it were just part of the emotional furniture of the house we grew up in. The problem is that this silence, instead of protecting us, shapes us. The silence you tolerate. Doesn't it seem like a choice? But what if it's actually an unconscious reflection of something much older? Something that began when you were still too young to understand, but old enough to feel. Carl Jung believed that everything we don't face in childhood returns. It returns in disguise, in behaviours, in relationships, in patterns. And emotional silence is one of the cruelest disguises. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It doesn't hit hard, it wears you down day by day. But there's something almost no one notices about this. That silence you learn to accept as normal might be the very same one that silenced your inner child. And in this video, we won't just talk about pain. We'll explore where it's born, how it hides, and what it needs in order to finally be heard. Because when we silence our pain, we end up echoing the unsaid cry of a forgotten childhood. There is a hidden truth beneath the noise of everyday life. And maybe today you're ready to hear it. What we deny in ourselves appears in our life as fate. Carl Jung. At first glance, fear looks like an instinct, a natural reflex, a self-preservation response. But some fears are not so easily explained. They linger through life, silent but constant. They don't have a clear form, only presence. And often, that presence was born not from what happened, but from what was missing. Emotional neglect is just as powerful as explicit trauma. It doesn't shout, but it silences. It doesn't hit, but it freezes. As children, we need more than food, shelter, and instruction. We need to be seen. We need to be felt. When that is denied, the world becomes unstable. A place where loving might mean disappearing, and feeling for becomes dangerous. In that kind of environment, fear finds fertile ground. It learns that no one is coming to help, that crying won't be received, that anguish will be ignored, so the body adapts, the psyche closes, and a belief takes root. Feeling is wrong, showing pain is weakness, expecting care is foolish. This is the invisible origin of so many adult fears. Fear of intimacy, fear of rejection, fear of failure. Because at some point the child we once were learned that the world had no space for who we truly were, and so that child shrank inside us, still waiting to be seen. The emotional silence we tolerate today may be the same silence that shaped that early adaptation. It shows up in automatic phrases like, "I don't want to bother with some, I'm fine," or "it's nothing." But none of these phrases are born from real strength. They are born from defense, from an unconscious attempt to avoid reliving the pain of original omission. And what few understand is that this kind of fear is not irrational. It is deeply logical within the emotional history we carry. Fear is the living memory of neglect. It doesn't belong to the present. It lives in childhood, relived in every new moment of vulnerability. That's why it's not enough to rationalize our fears. We must return to the source, not to assign blame, but to understand. Because until we recognize the origin of our silence, it will keep guiding us. It will keep making choices on our behalf. It will keep deciding whom we trust with our hearts and whom we push away without knowing why. And maybe the most important question we can ask is not, "What am I afraid of?" but "What did I not receive when I needed it most?" This leads us to something even deeper. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Carl Jung. There is a trap you notice, but almost everyone falls into. It doesn't show up as a mistake or punishment. It comes disguised as choice, as preference, as pattern. And so, what we lived in childhood returns as a silent cycle. And the most intriguing part is, we don't even realise we're reliving what hurt us most. The emotional neglect that once silenced us doesn't disappear with time. It transforms. It becomes a kind of unconscious radar that leads us back to what's familiar, even if it's painful. We enter relationships with people who don't really see us, who don't truly listen, who make us feel exactly as we did when we were too young to ask for attention, but old enough to know it was missing. And so, we repeat. We repeat the omission, not by conscious choice, but through unconscious loyalty to what we know. Because what's familiar, even when it wounds, feels safe, feels right. The inner child within us only wants to be accepted, and she believes that if she can finally win the love of someone who ignores her, then she will be seen. It's like trying to rewrite the original story with a different ending. But the script stays the same, and every time the scene repeats, the wound deepens. And the more it bleeds, the more we believe we are the problem. That maybe we don't deserve care. That maybe silence is the price we pay for being in connection with others. But there's one detail that changes everything. Repetition is not a sentence. It is a calling. A reflection of what has not yet been understood. When we recognise that we are reliving old pain through new situations, we open the door to something that once seemed impossible, conscious choice. Because repetition is automatic, but choice is freedom. And we can only choose differently when we become aware of what is being repeated. When we clearly see that the silence we tolerate today echoes the emotional neglect of a time when we were too young to defend ourselves. And perhaps deep down, every recurring pain is only waiting for a different reaction. For a new gesture, a new word, a boundary that was never set, or a truth that was always swallowed. This leads us to a delicate moment. What we do not face in our unconscious returns as fate. And fate, more often than not, speaks with the voice of silence. Carl Jung. There is a kind of silence that doesn't set us free. It imprisons us. It doesn't protect. It perpetuates. Silencing yourself can look like strength, like maturity, like self-control. But when that silence comes from the same root that wounded you in childhood, emotional neglect, it becomes a confirmation of that pain, an inner echo saying, you don't deserve to be heard. That's when silence stops being a choice and becomes submission, not to peace, but to fear. A primal fear of being rejected, misunderstood, of making someone angry or being abandoned. So we swallow words, feelings, entire truths. And every time we remain silent in front of what truly matters, we tell our inner child once again, your voice still doesn't matter. This emotional silence shapes relationships, decisions, even the way we see ourselves. It teaches us to observe too much, to give too much, to wait too long. We wait for others to notice what we're feeling, to guess what we need. And when that doesn't happen, we feel a pain we can't quite explain. But it comes from far away. Because we're not just staying silent in the present, we are staying silent for all the times we weren't heard in the past. And each new silence is another stone on top of that memory, another layer over the wound. The pain doesn't go away, it adapts. And the more we silence it, the more we believe the problem is us. But here's something few people realise. Every silence we tolerate today reaffirms the message we once received. your feelings don't matter. And that message, when left unchallenged, becomes the foundation of a life half-lived. Relationships in which we're not whole, paths that aren't truly ours, lives that are not lived, just endured. That's why staying silent is not always noble. Sometimes it's just the repetition of a mission, a sophisticated form of self-abandonment, a habit learned so early it became invisible. But it's there, in every avoided conversation, in every boundary not set, in every truth swallowed to preserve a peace that only exists on the surface. And so the question arises, what would happen if this time you chose to speak? This leads us to something even deeper. The inner voice is the only true guide we have. Carl Jung. There is something profoundly transformative about speaking, but we're not talking about speeches, arguments, or casual opinions. We're talking about the voice that rises from a hidden place, a place buried beneath years of emotional silence, the voice that doesn't ask for permission, the voice that, when it finally finds a way out, doesn't just set words free. It sets the soul free. Because when we speak what we've hidden for so long, we create space for something new, listening. And that listening, once denied, begins with ourselves. Healing doesn't begin when others finally understand. It begins when we stop ignoring what we feel. When we offer our inner child what she never had, a channel to exist. To speak is not just to express. It is to rebuild. It is to gather the parts of ourselves that were broken in moments of omission. It is to say to the pain, I see you, I hear you, and you have the right to exist. The voice heals because it is the antithesis of the silence that wounds. It is the opposite movement of childhood paralysis. And what few understand is that the voice doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't have to be eloquent, rational, or pretty. Sometimes it comes out trembling. It comes out in tears, in long pauses. But even so, it is healing. Because it is real. And what is real always carries power. On the journey of self-discovery, giving voice to your own story is the most radical act of self-love. It's like reclaiming a territory that was taken from you in childhood. It's like saying to fear, you're no longer in charge here. And to pain, you can rest now. Carl Jung reminded us that what is not brought to consciousness repeats. And bringing something to consciousness often begins with speaking it aloud, bringing into light what has lived in the shadows for too long. And in doing so, the narrative shifts. The role of the silent victim becomes that of an awakened protagonist. But there's something even more subtle. When we listen to our own voice, we inspire others to do the same. We break, sometimes without even noticing, generations of emotional silence. We plant seeds of truth, of courage, of healing. And the world begins to change. From a single sentence we dared to speak. And perhaps more important than being heard is the simple fact that you're no longer silencing yourself. This opens the door to something even more intimate. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Carl Jung. To speak in its most intimate sense is a gesture of reunion, not with the world, but with yourself. It's looking within and saying, I deserve to exist fully. In a world that so often taught us to stay silent, to please, to survive, to belong, speaking becomes a revolutionary act, an act of self-love. To love yourself is not only to care for yourself, to value yourself, or to allow rest. It is, above all, to allow yourself to feel. And feeling inevitably asks for expression. There is no healing without listening, and there is no listening without a voice. Those who love themselves listen to themselves, and give themselves permission to take up space, even if the voice still trembles, even if the past still weighs heavy. To speak in this context is to stand before your inner child and say, "You can speak now, and I will listen." It's a movement that undoes years of emotional neglect, a verbal embrace for what was forgotten, a sense of relief that doesn't come from the outside, but from within. Because when you speak, you affirm that you are no longer willing to repeat the pain of being silenced. And the most curious thing is, the world responds. Little by little, your relationships change. Your choices begin to align. And your body, once tense and closed, starts to breathe again. Your voice becomes a bridge, a connection, a reconstruction, and what once was fear transforms into presence. True self-love doesn't scream, doesn't demand, doesn't confront. It expresses itself with calm strength, with truths that don't ask for approval, with words born from the clarity of someone who has faced their pain, but is no longer defined by it. And perhaps the most beautiful part is realizing that by speaking, you are not only setting yourself free, you are remembering yourself, remembering who you were before the silence, before the omission, before learning that you had to hide parts of yourself in order to be accepted. And then, everything makes sense. The voice that was once silenced is now the voice that heals. It is at this point in the journey that everything begins to fall into place. Every silence tolerated, every gesture repressed, every word left unsaid. None of it was just about the other person. It was about you, about the part of you that learned far too early not to disturb, not to need, not to feel. And then, everything makes sense. The silence you accept today didn't begin in adulthood. It was built, brick by brick, in the absences of childhood. Every time your pain was ignored, every time your feelings were dismissed, every time your existence was seen as too much, or not enough. That's where you learn to stay quiet. But are we truly ready to accept this? To accept that fear is not the enemy, but the messenger? That anger is not the problem, but the reminder. That pain, in fact, always wanted to speak, and all it ever needed was someone to listen, and that someone is you. This realization doesn't come to place blame. It comes to set you free. Because if silence was learned, it can also be unlearned. And if neglect shaped your fear, self-love can reignite your courage. The same voice that once went quiet now has the power to rebuild. In the end, the answer was always there, in that forgotten child hidden somewhere deep within you, waiting for someone to finally say, "I see you, I hear you, you matter." And now, what does that mean to you? Maybe the answer was inside you all along. If you made it this far, it's because something in you recognized this silent pain and is now ready to transform it. Because the silence you learnt to accept doesn't have to be your final voice. You can rewrite this story, not by erasing what you lived, but by honouring every part of it with compassion and courage. Throughout this video, you realise that the invisible, persistent fear has roots. Roots that go deep into childhood, where emotional neglect often took the place of care, where silence replaced listening. But now you have something you didn't have back then: awareness. And with it comes the real possibility of healing. To speak is no longer a risk. It's a rebirth. It's a quiet but powerful cry for freedom. It's you saying to yourself, "I deserve to be heard. By me. And by anyone who truly wants to know me." This is the beginning of a new cycle, where voice replaces fear, and self-love rebuilds everything that was once left behind. Now is the time to take the first step. Start applying these insights today, and later tell me in the comments what the experience was like for you. Tell me, which part of this reflection resonated most with you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be the mirror someone else needs to begin their own healing. And if you want to go even deeper into this journey, there's a recommended video right above that can add even more value to your path. See you in the next video.